Let's talk about privilege review and screening first. And I'll ask Dave Orenstein, how have you seen AI used for privilege review or screening?
Yeah, no, thanks, Bob. And I would explain in general, so the area of privilege review and the time and expense associated with it is, I'm sure for many folks on the call, as for myself over the years, has been a pain point. And, one of the areas where, I've seen, AI used is in better identifying potentially privileged, potentially confidential documents to provide a few benefits. I would probably describe them in three buckets. Risk mitigation, and I know a lot of people end up thinking AI, it's just going to be cheaper, we'll have the AI review it. A lot of the ways I've seen it used aren't necessarily that far down the road in terms of relying on AI to make privilege calls, but have seen benefits related to risk mitigation, so finding potentially privileged documents that the human eye may have missed. Speed, being able to categorize these documents, run AI on a set to find the potentially privileged documents a lot faster. And then also potential cost savings, that I can kind of talk to about some of my personal experiences. The one that I would highlight, kind of our first, opportunity to really see how this worked was in a proof of concept. And in that, I compared a prior document review and prior set that, I'm gonna hypothetically, talk about some numbers right now. Let's say 500,000 documents were reviewed. 50,000 of those documents were tagged potentially privileged through manual review process, and ultimately about 5,000 documents ended up on an eventual privilege log. So you had 50,000 potentially privileged documents, and eventually through privilege review, many layers get to the 5,000. We then tested that same set of documents through AI, and at the end result, we had about 7,000 privileged documents, and that set was 100% inclusive of the 5,000 that ended up on the privilege log. So the thing that was interesting in that proof of concept is that, there ended up being a lot less time manual review to get to the same set of privileged documents. And one of the main reasons, I think some companies may consider it is kind of for that risk mitigation benefit. In doing it even on that small set, we identified some examples where there were references to legal or, for example, to Dave, that didn't necessarily make it clear that Dave was Dave Orenstein, the lawyer, or that legal was, the legal department, as opposed to, some disclaimers or things, references to legal. And it was interesting because it ended up catching a few instances that even though we had, a more detailed review of potentially privileged and various layers, some things that ended up being missed because a reviewer maybe didn't know that when two business people were talking, their reference to Dave meant Dave in the legal department. And I have a little puppy here that's very dependent on me, so.
Okay, good. Thanks, Dave. Were you using a TextIQ product?
Yeah, we use PrivIQ with that POC.
Okay. Poor, if you're still around, talk to us briefly about PrivIQ, if you would, just to acquaint people with its features.
Absolutely, Bob. So let me give a bit of a history of how PrivIQ came into being. So we started the company in 2014 and did a lot of customer discovery, talked to people. And one of the pain points we found was automating privilege review. And I'm not talking about the entire review, more the first pass privilege review. So we didn't build PrivIQ in isolation in labs. Actually, for almost a year, we were just talking to people, to associates, junior, senior, service providers, contract reviewers, and asking them, what are some of the things that go through your mind as you're doing privilege review, and what are some of your pain points and challenges? And so through, in going through that process, we discovered a few opportunities that had a close connection to my 10 years of research, the problems we had solved for. But we essentially found a few nuggets that are really hard for human mind to do. Human mind is not good at multiplying long numbers. So as soon as it's tasked with something that's computationally heavy, that's actually better for a machine to do. So we identified a workflow, identified specific pain points in the process, and through our process, we're not eliminating humans. So let me give you a specific example, and Dave alluded to it. So an email that's between non-attorneys mentions David by first name basis. It's a common name. It's very hard for a human or a contract reviewer to look at that name, and out of thousands of potential Davids at the organization, figure out, hey, is it David Ornstein, the lawyer, or is some other David? That's a computationally heavy task. So we bring in machine learning to bear to solve for that problem, and our machines look at both the social network, how people communicate, who they communicate with, as well as language, the context in which David is being mentioned, to accurately figure out if this person is a lawyer or not. So that's one specific pain point we found, for example. But there's several pain points, and we collaborated with subject matter experts to build machine learning specific to these pain points, and that's how we've been able to solve the problem.
Well, let's talk about relevance review. Does AI, or have you seen it used in relevance determinations? That's a much bigger job. Perhaps the stakes are somewhat lower, but it's a huge task when you're confronted with data sets of many thousands or millions of documents. Have either of you seen the use of AI in terms of relevance review?
So, sir, I mean, I'm happy to kick that off, Dave, if you like. Sir, we've talked about a little bit of this already, at least the concepts. Prioritization, bucketing, staging, all of those are, I think you can have a good use case for the utilization of AI for relevance review as well. I've always been a big proponent of a phased approach to discovery, staging discovery, with the goal being, there's always just a really small set of documents that ultimately is going to decide a dispute. And anything that can help the parties, I think, and the court get to those documents quicker is a benefit, both from a cost perspective to the parties, but also from a judicial efficiency perspective. And AI has the ability to really help out with staging review, such that you get to those more meaningful documents earlier. So that's, I think even in traditional litigation, it has a cost benefit analysis or utilization for us. But even more so, I think, in actually just getting down to the substance of a case quicker.
I agree with that, John. I think also, Bob, I think that scenario with responsiveness, down the road will be when we're dealing with that in court and with opposing parties, because if, attorneys and judges can get comfortable with that technology, it gets to a point of, it's almost tantamount to an easy button compared to right now. If I'm reviewing 1 million documents, I might get, in a good case, to 60, 70% of those documents are responsive. If the parties can be clear on what really are the types of documents that we're looking for, and we run those same 1 million documents through AI, if people get comfortable with the precision and output of it, it could get to, as John said, we might be able to get to the 10,000, 5,000, 1,000 really core documents in a case. As we all know, when cases proceed to depositions or trial, in most cases, we're not at that point talking about hundreds of thousands of relevant documents that you're putting in front of a jury or judge. It's a much smaller set. And I think the future state, if we can get comfortable with it, would be taking the 1 million documents, applying some version of AI, and then avoiding all of that waste of, in most cases, if you looked at 1 million documents, there are hundreds of thousands of documents that you've spent a lot of money on that nobody's ever going to look at in a case.
Now let's bring Apoorv back, and Apoorv, put the last slide up and talk to us about how AI is used to flag relevant and non-relevant documents.
Great. So one of the key techniques we've heard that is used effectively for relevance review is predictive coding. There are many names for predictive coding. It comes in flavors like continuous active learning, TAR 1.0, TAR 2.0. But in the background, the way the machine is going about solving the problem is very similar. We're essentially giving machine a seed set, and tying this back to the tiger and not tiger example, you can think of relevant documents as tiger and non-relevant being other animals. So essentially, it's exactly the same process that goes through where some human, either they've done feature extraction or they've told the machine how to go from a document, which is unstructured, to a structured form. That structured form is then put into, that structured form with labels is then put into a machine learning algorithm. People can pick their favorite machine learning algorithm like neural networks, support vector machines. And then there's a model that can now look at unseen data and can start classifying or categorizing documents into relevant or not. So it's essentially exactly the same process we went through.
Thank you, John. Thank you, David. Thank you, Apoorv. Thank you for TextIQ for sponsoring this interesting program. And thank you all for attending.